I don't know what to say. It's such a pleasure to be in such an articulate and positive atmosphere for this music, because I'm used to having to deal with very different responses to what I do, especially in Europe, where I'm still defending the idea of playing electronic music as something that people should do. For people that really don't want to do this at all, and I guess. I'm going to be a little bit biographical because I think that the theory is very well worked out here, and I don't think I could ever go as deep as has been touched on this morning. And I'll just play the stupid musician as much as I can, and try to trace some of the threads. The one Sally's referring to in Touch was something that began 20 years ago, actually 10 years ago as Touch, but the original discussion was with Michelle and I about what we in those days called effort. Maybe you're calling it resistance now, but I think it's the same subject. But so we called it effort, and we were talking about it in terms of effort and expression, and that was just because that was kind of the first axis that we could use to get to, in our case, the music establishment in Europe to be able to deal with what we're doing and accept what we're doing on their turf, because it was a kind of turf war. We were trying to get people at EarCom to let us play, get people in Sonology where I teach to let us work there, and to basically accept us in the world of serious music, whatever it is, whatever you want to call it. And interestingly enough, now a lot of people come up to me and apparently think of this as about an issue of pure expression, as if we were trying to just you know, just deal with the sort of thing that classical musicians are dealing with when they interpret music. We're just trying to put an emphasis on interpretation rather than, again, composition. So in other words, we're again accused of being of shortchanging the compositional part of music because we're putting so much emphasis on something like touch or something like expression. But I know from the kind of conversations I've had and from what happened at Touch and what happened over all the years with Michelle is that isn't really what we meant. We really meant that that somehow the intelligence of music is located in a different place, we think, than what at least the traditional European music establishment thinks. We somehow feel that I mean, this is something which these days is not surprising to say, since feminism has taken over the idea of embodiment so much. There's a tremendous amount of literature about this. But at the time, it was a really difficult thing to argue that somehow there was another location in your nervous system for intelligence than just language. And language seems to be the main model for music, I think, in Europe still. It's a kind of conversation. It's a kind of grammar. It's a kind of structuring, and structuring that's specifically linguistic. It's about, I would call it like algebras of expression or algebras of music. And the reason I call this talk "Knowing When" is just my own. This is just my own personal experience as being an algorithmic composer. When I came to Europe, I was using my little Apple II computer actually in 1979 to make kind of improvised electronic music, and the thing that I had to do then was to apologize or actually hide the fact that I was touching the computer. Because the idea of algorithmic music was something that you did without touching. That somehow hands off was a positive thing. It's like like when you ride a bicycle, look ma, no hands. Somehow that's, it is. I mean, it's obviously, I still can't ride a bicycle without my hands. But so it's got something to do with me wanting to touch things. And so I had to kind of hide the fact that I was interfering with the algorithms, because I always felt the algorithms weren't quite right. This doesn't sound right. If I just do that now, it'll sound right. And then it took me a really long time to realize, one, that was a good thing to do, that it was okay to play. That just shows how, in a sense, alienated I was from the idea of playing as an electronic musician. But then, two, to kind of conceptualize it as a kind of knowledge. The fact that I knew when it was wrong. I know when to do something. And I don't know it because of some algebra, because of some descriptive thing. But it's just, it's what they call, I guess, in philosophy, the intuitive or the tacit dimension or something like that. It's just the part that's not describable, the part like driving a car or parking a car, something like that. your little brother says, "Teach me how to." I have to take the driving test. Teach me how to parallel park, and teaching doesn't consist of explaining how to do it, or at least it isn't a very good way to do it. It's actually, you just get in the car with him and let him try to parallel park and give nervous advice that doesn't help at all until he figures out how to parallel park, because it's not something you can explain to somebody. And I think music is like that too. There's an awful lot of things you can explain, but ultimately when you get down to it, it's something the person has to invent for themselves. And it's, again, that's not to be on the side of what the French call irrationalism. It's not that music is an irrational thing. It's just that it's just not something that I think is about description. I think you can describe it after the case. I think the idea of composition is something I got from working with Bill Forsyth. I've said this to a lot of times, a lot of people, but I was sitting with him one day and a bunch of journalists were there asking him questions about choreography, and these are kind of silly questions that journalists ask. And they said, well, how do you define choreography? And he said, choreography is a channel for the desire to dance. And I was floored, absolutely floored, because it came right out of his mouth. It was like, there was no pause. He just said it like that. And I thought, yeah, composition is a channel for the desire to sing or something. I don't know. You can't say that. You just can't say that in music. It's a forbidden thing to say. Composition is the thing that you're supposed to be doing. And music is somehow what? An after effect of composition. And so that, yeah. Like I say, this is just kind of biographical steps along the way towards me, becoming a born-again musician, I guess you'd say. And, but it was easy because I was there in Amsterdam with Michel. Michel was a natural. He was someone who had none of these fears. And, but I think there's a lot of work to be done probably in neurology and psychology about this issue of knowing when, because it's so clear that this is a really articulate knowledge. I mean, it's a knowledge which clearly is related to riding the bicycle and playing basketball, which is a really offensive thing to say around composers. They don't like the idea that music is anything like playing basketball at all. They want it to be like nuclear physics or like Heidegger, right? But it's not. It's actually not. And the problem is to get people to accept that this is an intelligent thing to do, that this is an intelligent human activity, just because it isn't something that is well rendered as language. And one of the things I noticed to help arm me, because I see it as a kind of combat, or to arm me in this fight to allow me to keep playing music, but allow my students to keep playing music or to start playing, because actually I teach at an institute where the students still don't feel comfortable playing electronic music, depending on what country they're from. And it's an international school, Synology, the language is English, and the whole conservatory of language is English. And so we get students, I'd say the number one language in the conservatory is Spanish, and after that maybe, I don't know, Korean or something. So it's a very international school, and that's one of the best things about it, because you get this kind of context discordance or context juxtapositions that happen because people actually have totally different ideas of what they think they're doing when they play noise music, for example, or electronic music. And I'm sorry, I'm drifting around, but the knowing when thing is something I got from reading William Calvin, who's this neurologist from I think University of Washington State, and he's quite famous for sort of trying to dig around what are the neurological sort of missing links for language. What is it that allowed language to evolve? Not in terms of language as syntax or language as context or semantics or something like that, but language as a mechanical act. And because he did a lot of, he's a pretty good neurologist, but also archaeologist, and he's done a lot of studies of different kinds of human activities. And the conclusion is that the timing precision of a lot of things like throwing and catching and obviously language require a kind of timing accuracy which is faster than neurons fire. And you can read about this. There's a lot of interesting talk about this. He was the guy who started this conversation. And so he started trying to develop a theory which other people developed much better of how you could colonize neurons or colonize groups of neurons and be able to produce, on the average, a higher timing response than a single neuron could achieve. This is a little bit hard to understand, but if you're willing to go through the math, it's there. And he gives it an example. These piles of stones they find in Africa, which are all Neolithic sites, in which the stones are sort of vaguely frisbee shaped, and people have never known what they are until somebody who played frisbee got there and realized that they were frisbees. And what he says they are, I mean, I don't know if this is true, is that before they developed spears and arrows and things like that, that our ancestors captured game by throwing stones at them, and when they fell down, jumping on top of them and then beating them to death or something like that. So the stones were an important part of stunning or confusing the animal enough so you could just run up and jump on it or something. And these stones were frisbee-shaped throwing stones. And he spent a lot of time trying to figure out what the accuracy would be required for hitting an antelope running at 40 miles an hour or something like that with a stone. And that's where he discovered this sort of incongruence, this amazing ability that we have to hit moving objects, which he sees as the original source of things like language and music. Well, I don't know if this is true or not, but it made me think a lot about how deep the, you might say, how far back this hardware has to go, this development has to go, because obviously it's an evolutionary as well as a learning kind of thing. So somehow our bodies were adapted to do this as well. Because clearly, even though we have nice things to say about other primates, we're much more elegant than they are on the average. I mean, we can move really well. You can't imagine chimpanzees and bonobos doing any of the kinds of things we do in the Olympics. So actually, we're quite highly evolved mechanically. And even though we tend not to say that, we all see ourselves as these clumsy humans surrounded by these glamorous animals. But in fact, in our particular lineage, we're doing pretty well. And anyway, this is just, this is, like I say, this is just sort of ammunition I use in my head when I'm trying to figure out if it's true that music is a special kind of knowing. It's a special kind of knowledge which is not touched in other places. In other words, the best example I can think of, I studied physics in California, and I was around lots of people like Richard Feynman and the people from Caltech. And Richard Feynman is famous for struggling with his problems on the floor. And he literally wrestled with problems in physics. In other words, he would, I know from my own experience, when I have to solve a computer program or a DSP thing, that it's, for me, it's about lying down and visualizing. It's all about visualizing models and seeing how they flow and solving the problems in a kind of animation or something like that. But in his case, it was literally about throwing things around in the air in his head and sort of struggling with the dynamics. And he's a pretty smart guy, and he came up with quantum chromodynamics and some other really amazing pieces of mathematics. But he did them by observing simulations in his own brain and watching things flying around in the real world. He's said to have invented quantum chromodynamics by watching a food fight at Cornell University when he was a young professor, watching the way the patterns on the dishes were wobbling. He was watching the dishes going across the cafeteria in this nice autistic physicist way, and he was watching the ratio of the wobbling of the dish to the rotation of the pattern on the dish. And he noticed something about that, which said, "Ah." So in my incoherent way, what I'm trying to say is that there is a kind of knowledge which is very difficult to approach through symbol manipulation, and very easy to approach through knowing when. In the same way that everyone has the experience, no matter how amateur they are, when they first sit down as a child at the piano or whatever instrument you sit down at being able to play music right away. Before you've decided that it isn't music, when you're young enough to just enjoy yourself, you know exactly what to do. And later on, you know when you didn't get it right. But even that shows there's this special kind of knowledge. The fact that we know it isn't right is not something you learn, by going to music school. you somehow are able to acquire that through but being in the world, through being through playing tennis and riding a bicycle and walking and singing in the shower and all those kinds of physical activities. And I mean, I'm confused a little bit today because I realize I'm preaching to the converted, but like I say, most of my audiences are people who are very resistant to the idea that composition isn't a completely formal exercise. That structure must, by its very nature, be language. That you can't structure any other way. That like Luciano Berio was saying, well, improvisation, it's all so bad. They can't even do it well. He doesn't, he can't hear it. He can't hear the possibility of structure in an improvisation situation. Or Pierre Boulez, who says musicians, well, if they were good, they'd be composers, or something like that. So this is the continental perspective that I have to deal with on a kind of daily basis, and it's of course a very narrow world, because there's plenty of crazy Germans out there and crazy Spaniards and crazy French people who all want to improvise and play music too. But yeah. Like I said, my own particular special experience is the one of finally accepting the fact that I could interfere with the computer. And so then I made making the computer as an instrument a kind of task. And it was a very difficult thing to do. And I still have, as you'll see, very primitive interfaces, in a sense, very primitive interfaces, but ones which do allow me to somehow touch the sound, or touch the music, whatever it is that I'm touching. Because I'm not sure what that is. That's another confusing thing, because I think there's a kind of built-in, not just ambiguity, but a built-in contradiction in electronic music. In other words, because we're trying to do something ineffable, something that's new, something that doesn't exist, something that's impossible. On the other hand, we're trying to do it with concrete, physical interfaces. We're, like me and you, we're trying to make interfaces, we're trying to play it, and yet we're trying to do something which is maybe unplayable, or can't be played, or can't exist in some way. I don't know what that is, but I know that quest is there. That's the reason for noise music, I think. It's that idea, because noise music so embodies that idea of something which is a transcendental possibility of sound in some way, since anything is possible, basically anything. But I remember the first time I was aware of noise music when somebody came up to me and said, so you make noise music? And that was like 20 years ago. Somebody told me I was making noise music, and I had no idea, and I was very offended, actually, at the time. I'm not offended, but I felt like, So I wasn't eager, but it's interesting that's a category in which a lot of people feel comfortable with. And it's a category which is transnational. I mean, it started out, I don't know where, you have to ask Douglas Kahn, but it started out in very different ways in a lot of different places, and then converged in this concept of noise music, which at Stein we have a lot of that. We have a lot of guys coming, basically making something which they would agree is noise music, but to me it's just, I think it's more of a cultural category than it is a phenomenal category, because like a lot of music, it all changes with time and history. We're getting used to noise music now. Getting used to it. I'm not getting used to glitch music, but it's okay. I tried to think of a couple of things I could talk about in my problems with playing music by talking about things I can't do. Like I can't look and listen at the same time, because I think a lot of people can relate to this. One of the things I do is in making interfaces, I try to make the interfaces as visually stable as possible. And I work in Super Collider a lot, and I have a real problem now with the recent Super Collider kind of generation, because this generation likes exciting visual events as a context for music making. In other words, they like the idea that windows pop up on the screen while you're playing your music, and you have to spend a lot of time searching around because you never know where the window's going to pop up and things like that. And I can't make music when things like that happen visually. So I have a lot of trouble. Like when I was working with the ballet, the first piece we did, I think we did it 60 or 70 times. And I don't think I saw the ballet for the first 20 times, at least, because I just wasn't able to watch the ballet and play music at the same time. And I was in the orchestra pit looking at the stage, but I wasn't focusing. I was just looking, sort of vague, unfocused, focused distance. So I don't know what this means, but it's got something again to do with the embodiment issue. Apparently, for me, being a verbal and text-oriented person, I have to somehow shut that down a lot in order to be able to hear. And I don't know. I think that must differ for lots of people. I mean, clearly, classical musicians spend a lot of time looking while they play. In fact, a lot of classical musicians are famous for not being able to play certain kinds of modern scores because there's nothing to look at. In other words, they have a lot of trouble if they're not given the normal visual cues, even though clearly, they play with such great proficiency they don't need it. You can hear the ability when they when they're rehearsing, but they actually don't need to do that. But I need to do that, and. Another thing I couldn't do, which I don't know if this is related, but when I'm programming, I can't look at the screen when I'm inventing the code. I think that's maybe the generational thing, I don't know. But when I'm working on an algorithm or making something to transform sound and thinking about it, like I was talking about lying on the floor is my favorite place to design. I can't actually look at code and design at the same time. And I think it's because there's a what do you call it, a dissonance between grammar and design. In the case of kind of design I'm trying to do, whatever it is that I think I'm doing, it's that somehow that the grammar of the computer language is a different representation or a different kind of logic that doesn't give me any access to the kinds of things I'm trying to do. Which is the reason I suppose a lot of, especially older generation writers, have resisted using computers. They want to keep using their pencil or their nice pen and a yellow pad or something like that. But it's different because in this case I think it's got to do with the grammar. Again, it's got to do with the grammar of thinking about these things, thinking about music. And if I could use that word grammar to describe the kind of knowledge of knowing when, then I just would say there's just a different grammar in thinking about things like digital signal processing than there is in thinking about programming in C or SuperCLUD or some other elaborate logical linguistic kind of construct. And so for me, the relation to the computer is not just about making a touchable interface, but finding a way to this this non-verbal world, I guess. But is that just a context thing? I just belong to a particular club of incoherent musicians or something like that. I don't think so, but it's possible. It's possible that all these kind of generalizations I'm making are really just to my own particular nervous system, my own particular whatever brain chemistry, I mean, I think that's one of the problems that we have in music is that we need to generalize. We need to assume that everybody's hearing the same thing we're hearing. We need to feel there's an audience. We need to feel that there's a community in some way, in a way that maybe visual arts don't need to feel, because it's a much smaller groups of people involved. And somehow in music it's the way people always want to say that music is the universal language or something like that. To insist somehow that no matter where you are on Earth, everyone's going to be able to like your music. And is that a completely ridiculous thing to say? I sometimes wonder. Because my experiences in noise music, I was telling an anecdote at lunch of playing in a noise club in Tokyo and realizing that my idea of what noise music was and their idea of what noise music, not their, but my partner's idea of what noise music was completely orthogonal. There was no matching. There was no contact. I mean, the only contact was the jack on the mixer. And other than that, we were in two separate musical existences, musical continuums. And but it's just noise music, though. There should be no problem there. But I don't know. I'd like to get feedback about that. That's the thing. Does anybody else have any of these kinds of disconnections? Because for me, music, maybe it's because I studied physics and studied something which was so much about a descriptive language, mathematics in the case of physics, that I was looking for something other in the case of music. But then in the end, I found out that I could use the mathematics to construct this other. I use DSP, which is basically a mathematical language, to construct some way of making sound. And it seemed to me there's some sort of paradox there, which is the human condition. Something about the way Lars was talking about it too, and you as well. There's a kind of, I don't know. I feel like I'm a living paradox in that sense, you know, that I'm not. I can't argue to be a coherent character. That I have the music stuff I do at night, and then all this other stuff I have to do in the daytime, and justify being able to get away with music. I don't know. Does anybody else have that kind of sense of not being able to do two things at once? Because that's the thing. I've talked to George Lewis about this, and he has an issue because he says that improv too much. It's too much the case that Europeans and in the discussion of improvised music tend towards the idea of enthusiasm. And he wants to say that his music is very rational, his music is composed, and the music of his friends from the AACM or something like that is a kind of self-conscious rational music, just like European music. It's not so different. It's not some sort of trance experience. But I feel that that's a kind of argument he's making within as an Afro-American musician in the context of American music, and I don't have to make that, but I still feel that kind of discussion is important discussion. Do you know what I mean? It's like
Isn't that one of the first experiences of making something with Max MSP that you work on each individual bit to build up your patch, and each bit works, and you understand how it all goes together, and then you get it all up on the screen to perform with it, and suddenly you can't see it all anymore. So you can't. It doesn't actually control things the way you imagined it.
You imagined it, yeah. Yeah, that's certainly the case. But it's interesting that the software I write, I usually have to wait a year before I can play it well. And that's not a long time by comparison to learning the trombone or something like that. But it has to sit around. And I used to feel like I have to forget how it works in order to be able to hear how it works. Because if I'm thinking about it from the point of view of the grammar or the patch or something like that I nerd out, that I'll just I'll clutch up or something like that. So I really have to kind of make something which is blind in some way, blank, and hide the structure in some way from myself. But not really. I think it's just the competition between listening and other things. To be able to really listen thoroughly, I have to shut down certain other kinds of thinking. And touch isn't one of the things I have to shut down. Interestingly enough, I can grope around, play my instruments, whatever it is, pick up a violin or something, and fool around with it. That doesn't somehow interfere with listening. But
isn't it? I mean, not a brain scientist, but not any sort of scientist. But some of the stuff I've been reading recently has been sort of suggesting that the bits of the brain what do listening and the bits of the brain what do moving are actually in very close communication with each other in ways that the bits of the brain that maybe does grammar and syntax aren't. And that there is, I mean, and it, if you take an evolutionary perspective on this, it would make sense that anything that's connected directly with senses of immediate awareness would have fairly fast connections through to evasive action or taking an opportunity or something like that.
I used to think about that in terms of speed. For me, one of the characteristics of the music that I like is speed. Believe it or not, I mean, it's like a kind of universal, like going to that point where actually it's a little bit too fast to follow. That's sort of an exciting place to be in a lot of kinds of music. And then reading in neurology that the speed of the kinds of things you're talking about, which is reaction time speed, is 10 or 100 times faster than the speed of a self-consciousness, of self-conscious reflection, which is, I will say, 400 or 500 milliseconds to form a self-conscious moment. And that's way too slow for music. You could never do anything with 400 milliseconds in music.
Everything would have a 500 millisecond delay on it.
Well, you can think of it as delay, but I think of it as just tempo. Speed again. So at that speed, you're just slowing things down to way below interesting threshold.
Half a second.
Yeah. Something like that. And that's just one. You need several of them to put together a phrase. So. But yeah, delay is another way to look at it. there's another issue which is I think of it in terms of like breaking symmetry, is that the way the parameters or the ingredients of electronic music are conceived of when in language or in technical languages like programming languages is uniform and a continuum usually. Usually discrete, to be like MIDI 127 or something like that, or 0 to 1, but some sort of smooth, continuous, one-dimensional space. And it seems to be that that's always been the problem for electronic music, is that we have to somehow break that symmetry in order to be able to give some kind of structure to that continuum. It has to have highs and lows. It has to have places that are warm and hot and interesting, places that are, in the case of the express resistance idea, places that are difficult to get to. And computers don't have that kind of structure. Language, in fact, doesn't have a way of putting that structure. Algebra doesn't have a way of putting that kind of structure into a simple continuum like 0 to 1. It's something which comes. It's like Mandelbrot. He's recast his theory now. He calls it, doesn't call it facts. He calls it a theory of roughness. And he says, and it doesn't come from. Well, interesting. Mandelbrot says it doesn't come from language. He says in every science goes through a stage in which it is a relationship to nature, like somebody like Faraday, and then later a stage when it becomes language. And usually the innovation happens in the natural stage. And so I think that's an advantage we have in electronic music, is we're still grasping at this natural stage, but we have to hold on to the natural, meaning the physical world, because it has bumps in it, whereas the simulated world doesn't have bumps. The color spectrum is just a series of numbers, none of which have any preference within themselves. All the preferences come from our physical embodiment. And so that's one of the problems for simulation, the fact that we have to import this. We have to always import this in order to break the symmetry. In order to break the symmetry of those ranges of numbers that have absolutely no distinction, we have to look to the natural world. And that's I think the main argument for good, strong, crunchy interfaces. And looking at the Velcro guitar, it's an absolute exercise in asymmetry, you might say. Things are not only not symmetrically placed, but they're opportunistic in time. Suddenly you go for a rearrangement.
It's interesting what you're saying about tactile feedback, and because I think of sound as touching a distance and actually vibrating inside the ear. It's like you can listen and feel an instrument. Like if I was trying to play something difficult on guitar, if I was actually trying to work it out, I would need to look away to get it into my fingers.
To look away, yeah.
It's not actually a case of learning it and getting that visual feedback. That's the point.
Well, they said that when you learn the guitar, don't look at your fingers. Right?
Yeah. But then also,
of course, you have to a little bit, but then you
to
realize
get
that it's true.
To get them in the right place in the first place, but then actually be able to repeat it and ingrain that, it's not not visual. But then this tried about a year ago doing a lot of improvisation with visuals and just pre-recorded video and music at the same time, and I found that incredibly distracting. The only way I could do it is
you're trying to play along with the beat,
just a kind of generate the patch, throwing out video, and the hands were kind of cueing it.
Okay.
But it was, I had to just decide, right, I'm making music and these cameras are looking at this and this is a randomized process. But I couldn't take on board that visual and respond to it as well. So that was just kind of resonates with me, that idea of the visual modality blocking out, without listening, and tactile feedback.
I think two of the key terms that you used and you returned to a few times were modelling and simulation. And it seems to me that one of the things that you're describing in our inability to yet make the digital world as interesting as we want it to is the paucity of our imagination when it's brought to the business of making interfaces to digital activity. It's that we're using a logical or grammatical or linguistic kind of knowledge or a mathematical kind of knowledge to map onto things which are not the kind of knowledge that you say you have to suppress when you're performing, to model something which in fact needs to draw on embodied and tactile kinds of knowledge. And I mean, in a way, it links to sort of some of the things I was going to talk about tomorrow about sort of dissident interface design, where you know the people will be familiar with from places like IRCAM with the kind of the logic that one of the essential things about making an interface is that if you have a fader or if you have a slider, one of the essential things is that it must be predictable. Another is that it must have a rational logic for moving from one place to another. Another is that it must be continuous. All of those things, of course, in terms of embodied knowledge, are absolutely wrong.
Wrong, yeah.
What you need is a fader which has a point at which it does nothing at all, and then it glitches, and then it flips into another behaviour, and the point at which that must happen must not be consistent, and it must not be continuous. It should remap over time, so that you constantly have a kind of a difficult relationship with it.
Yeah.
And that's the thing that enables you to, in your terms, know when. Because you can't know when on something that has no texture.
No texture at all. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Well,
and
your
I think,
body, in a sense,
and
could
I think
learn
at the
something,
moment
but-
we're just at the point where modelling and simulation is beginning to become sophisticated enough to allow us to deal with those kinds of things, with what you might call creaky interfaces or dissident interfaces, or things which seem in one sense to be illogical, but in fact, in terms of tactility, are absolutely logical.
Yeah. Well, it used to be. I used to talk about this. I remember talking about it in Glasgow, actually, 20 years ago, or something like that, when I was first there. Is this in engineering? There's this concept of simplicity and orthogonality, which so we don't. I don't think we have to blame the French. We can blame at IRCAM. We can blame engineers when they approach a problem. They want to separate as much as possible all of the parameters from each other, so that when you turn one knob, all the other knobs don't turn.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's a concept. That's a basic engineering concept.
It's to do with one-to-one mapping or one-to-many
Yeah, but
mapping.
it's also divide and conquer. The idea we're going to solve first this problem, and if we can establish that they're orthogonal, meaning there's no influence from this to this, of course, that's just not what music instruments are like. I mean, think about a saxophone, embouchure, or even what you're touching on the string of a violin. It's not just one thing you're touching. It's not just one parameter you're holding in your mouth. It's innumerable
It's
parameters.
an intersensoriality of
Yeah, and when you move your mouth, they all change. And the idea of a synthesizer is no, you turn this knob and only the phase of the oscillator is going to be advanced, right? But not the frequency, or something like that. And whoa, that kind of thinking, it makes a lot of sense in engineering. It's interesting, scientists don't think that way, but engineers do. And so the problem is that, of course, engineers own electronic music, and we're so dependent on them. But it's interesting that also is that electronic music has been stymied for the last 15 or 20 years. And maybe it needs to be hacked away by hackers again, just like it was when David Tudor or somebody like that picked it up. It's because they're the kind of people who are not going to approach it with these strange beliefs that
well,
engineers
it's
have.
It's a generation of people who are interested in Tudor and people
Yeah.
like that again.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, yeah. Or
So maybe
more.
there's some hope.
Yeah.
In terms of your sort of discussion of music as a universal language,
Yeah.
it made me think of the work at actually Edinburgh University, Colin Trevarthen's work at Edinburgh University. He's got quite a sort of biologist, psychobiologist, and he's now got quite compelling sort of evidence that the earliest communication between a parent and a child is essentially musical. The cooing and the babbling and what psychologists call motherese,
Yeah.
those interact. It's not prototypical language. It's not in that you hear
Yeah.
the earliest forms of language, and it grows. It actually is. It's musical and it's improvisatory as well.
Yeah.
So in a sense, music plays a fundamental role in that earliest and most important bonding relationship of our life, and that we're all musical from that very early stage. But then something happens in the way in which society constructs the image of a musician, and vast numbers of people in society say, "Well, I'm not musical," because
Yeah.
we define music
Yeah.
through quite specific cultural. Some of the work we've done with professional musicians, it's not the case that you go to university and you get a degree in music and then society says, "Oh, you're allowed to call yourself a musician." Whether you see yourself as a musician or not is much more of a social construct.
Sure.
We've interviewed people that have spent 30 years playing music and they've got lots of qualifications and they teach, but they'll say, "Oh no, I'm not a musician. It's my brother Bob. He plays in the Berlin Philharmonic. He's a musician in the family. I just dabble." Or you speak to young children that play every night in a band and they're 16, 17, who have no formal qualifications, but for them they are musicians,
Musicians,
and they define themselves
Yeah.
through their music. So this sense of are you a musician, are you not a musician is much more a sort of
Mhm.
social
Yeah.
social construct. And then lots of people will then say, well, I'm in fact just the taxi driver this morning has taken me down to the train station, and I told him where I was going. I'm not musical, I'm tone deaf. But actually, to cut a very long story short, tone deafness doesn't exist. It's a social construction. 14% of the population will self-refer as tone deaf, but actually less than 1% actually have what we would call
some sort of deficient.
tone deafness. So we're constantly, we have to construct an elite notion of what a musician is in order to preserve the status of composers and all of us that are playing music. And in order to have that, you have a sort of underbelly of society that see themselves as non-musicians in order to preserve that status.
I think we've argued it's a bit more. It's also context specific though. The person that will sit there and say I'm not a musician in relation to them will sit and say I'm a musician if you're asking them what somebody else is playing they don't like. So those things are always flexible for any one person. It's not that somebody goes about all their life with a sack on their head saying I'm not a musician. They just put that on in certain people.
But it is amazing to be when I speak to people, people often recount their earliest negative experiences of music. They will say, I really wanted to play the guitar, I love music, but 20, 30, 40 years old, I was at school and the teacher was deciding who was going to be in the choir or who was going to get to play the guitar, and I couldn't do that test. And I was told to go and play in the football team or whatever. And people take that very early non-contingency experience of music and they'll internalise it and memorise it for a long time. And it goes back to that comparison between playing music is it like physics or is it like cooking? Do you know what I mean? At its earliest, simplest level, music is motor coordination in the same way that driving a car is motor coordination. But sort of popular wisdom suggests that if you go to driving lessons for long enough, eventually you pass the car.
Yeah.
Nobody would say, I'm not one of God's drivers.
Yes.
But it's not a problem to say, I'm not one of God's musicians, I don't have music genius.
Exactly.
But at that basic level.
Yeah.
And then similarly, how do we learn to play music? We learn by, how do we learn? We learn by making mistakes. And, So why should your first fundamental error in music consign you to not playing music? If we took that comparison to other situations, how do we learn to walk? We learn to walk by falling over a lot. And if a child fell over a couple of times and somebody said, you're not one of God's walkers, can you go and sit in the non-walking? So there's something about music has a very strange cultural position.
Very strange, priestly or something or whatever.
I just wanted to say, I don't think it's just music that does that. I mean, there are all kinds of other areas where you get stamped on early, and the arts and other arts in particular, you can't draw. You're not an artist. Sports as well. I mean, these things.
Sport. I wasn't sporty at school. Not because I wasn't interested in it or because I wouldn't have enjoyed doing it, but because I wasn't good enough to be on the football team. Then I was no good at sport, and that was it. And the kids who are no good at sport, we got to sort of just sit and shiver in the rain.
Isn't that how you became a musician? In fact, the kids that were no good at sport became musicians.
Well, no, interestingly enough, I actually wanted to be able to play football, and I wanted to be able to play the violin, and I couldn't do either. Because I wasn't as good as the other kids at school playing football, and we only had one violin, and somebody else was already playing it. So there we are.
Well, then electronic music is just another channel for the desire to sing.
Yeah.
In the same way. Or play football. Yeah, right. Or drive cars.
It's interesting you bringing up that that quote again. The choreography is the channel, because when you were saying that, I was thinking about Christopher Small and his theory of musicking, and one of the sort of ideas that he bases his theory on is this may be a paraphrase instead of a quote, but he says music exists in order to give performers something to do. And the whole idea of music is an event. It's something people do instead of something somebody's written down and composed and universalized in that sense. And I think that plays into what you're saying.
Surprised at the narrowness of your idea of music. After all, almost all cultures and all rituals have a music.
Narrow in what sense then?
Chanting.
Yeah.
making noises, playing any sort of instrument,
Yeah.
not that playing the piano,
Yeah.
or having sort of formal lessons at school or
Mhm.
anything like that. It's normal within all cultures.
Oh, exactly. But also, that's the miracle of why is it that we, let's say, as non-virtuoso pianists, can enjoy virtuoso piano music? That's the miracle of music, is that we actually don't have to play instruments to understand the music that's played on the instrument. Even the best of the music is played on instruments.
Yeah.
And so that.
But music comes from, I mean, there is to be a basic music within
Mhm.
people, because, and then you're not talking about babies and mothers, but within all cultures have their own basic music that they will have. Even our culture
Mhm.
go back far enough into more tribal.
But you should also say all cultures also have forbidden music. All cultures, at least all the major ones I know about, have forbidden music at some point, or continuously, or right this minute.
You need to stop.
No, they just say it's not good for you, that it's a bad thing to do, that it's bad for people,
Yeah.
that it shouldn't be done on Sunday or Thursday or whatever,
Or in
and,
church,
or in church,
when somebody's died.
yeah, or any of those things. So music is it's a very edgy thing in cultures for some reason. This guy, there's a really interesting book by, huh?
You think maybe personally, even if it's, well, obviously, if it's forbidden, people still continue with their own internal music.
Yeah.
Humming is
Yeah.
your own music, isn't it?
Yeah, but it's such a social activity. If it's forbidden, you're losing a lot. If you're just off by yourself in some way, I think, yeah. Which is, but I mean, there's an interesting book. This guy, what's this American historian? He has a book. I'll remember his name when I have to talk about it. But he has a book called "Moving Together in Time," and it's about this kind of impulse to do music. And he's a historian, a world historian, kind of writes history of the world, kind of historian from Colombia. I can't remember his name. Guy, really famous old guy now, and he's talking about the difficulty for primates to be together in large numbers. Primate males. This is about beyond the number, say 15 or so. You can't put that many, orangutans or chimpanzees or bonobos together. And same thing with humans. Maybe more than a dozen or so males together in a room is a fight. In primate society, yeah, right. No, we've got a lot of stuff keeping us under control. And he's saying this is his theory. His theory is that dancing is the way that males learned how to be together in large numbers. Because how do you put together an army? How do you put together a non-street war town in Italy or something?
Oh, Joe will take you up to St James's Park tonight.
Yeah, right, exactly. Well, these people should dance together more.
There's a lot of music in
Yeah.
people. I mean, there's the chanting, it's a natural,
Yeah.
huge expression of
Yeah.
music to support lots of men together.
And it makes a natural bond, which is socially extremely dangerous, which is the reason it's forbidden at the same time. Because a bunch of people out in the street dancing together constitute a political party immediately. They already know who they are. They are this group. And they know they can take power. It's like knowing when, they know who, or what.
What society are you particularly talking about, maybe, at the moment?
I'm thinking about our European societies. Yeah.
Well,
It's-
I think there's dancing,
Yeah.
dancing forbidden in any of our Europe.
It is. I don't know. In Europe, nobody knows how to dance. I'm from America, and I watch when I go out dancing. And when I was young, I would go dancing. I see people dance, and when you go to a disco in Amsterdam, nobody's dancing. They're just sort of standing around.
Our government legislated against raves not too long ago.
Yeah.
Which
Yeah, not too long ago.
There was no dancing in Britain on a Sunday until 40 years ago.
Really? On Sunday, 40 years ago. See?
that makes sense though. That's just
That's just decent. Yeah. Yeah. No.
He,
He-
lots of people out dancing and having a huge fun time all over Europe, and they certainly do in Newcastle and Sunderland.
Yeah. Well, there's dancing. He gives an example. There's a famous scene in the Bible somewhere in Solomon where Solomon dances naked on the tables, which is hardly ever discussed by ministers and priests on Sunday, because it's a problematic question. Why is Solomon suddenly dancing? Well, it turns out when he was young, he was dancing. He's a famous sexy poet, right? But then he became a king, and what happens in that scene is he's somehow noticing in the street a bunch of people dancing, and he wants to dance too. But it's in order to control society, you have to repress that need, that spontaneous need.
Or organise it.
Or organize the structure, which is what his book starts out with. He talks about being a soldier in 1940, doing that kind of marching that they did while they were warming up, and he was in England. He was in some sort of American army thing, and they were all out marching around in the rain. And he says everyone liked it. They all talked about what shit it was, but when they were doing it, they really enjoyed it, and that's how he noticed. Because he was noticing that everybody agreed that it was actually fun to march in some way, in this way. It's kind of organized. And he saw marching as just another version of what the Hoplites did. The Hoplites are famous for having this kind of war dance stuff that they did. And they were able to defeat a much more organized army of Persians who were not dancers, apparently. Anyway, it's an interesting book, Moving Together in Time. And,
Joel, I
Yeah.
think
move on.
we're going to move together in time for another solid day. I think some of those questions on I can never pronounce that word. Orthogonality and the sort of discretization of functions and things like that we'll come back to, because if Simon's wanting to tap into that, that's great, because so am I this afternoon. I think also I'd like to challenge you, but maybe later, not challenge, but I'd like to pick up again on this notion of where is the heritage from engineering as opposed to other systems, because it seems to me that there are also signs of holistic, emergent, systemic structures coming through certain sorts of engineering culture.
Oh, cool.
And I think if you really, we were talking this morning about this notion of non-fixity of cultural codings and structures, which was really prompted by Lars's presentation. I think perhaps what we consider as being atomized or compartmentalized in a given period and sometimes through pendulum swings is replaced by more holistic systems. Maybe this is something that we can also see reflected through different sorts of software practices in the arts. I don't know.
Well, you could say that one of the tropes of modernism is efficiency, isn't it? And you make people efficient by discretizing functions. And that's been the whole story of
except that bioinformatics is as an engineering field is actually tearing that to bits quite vigorously.
Now.
So it'd be good to
but in some respects we haven't escaped that.
So I think there's lots of stuff to pick up on. So many thanks, and it's going to be good actually to see how fast you play. We're all going to.
Yes.
You shouldn't have said that, Joe.
Shouldn't have said that. Yeah.
Thank you. So shall we hand over to Nick Williams? Is that anybody want to?
Where's he?
Famous last words on Joel's?
No, we're just talking.
I just wanted to back up one thing you said about playing in a noise club in Tokyo.
Oh yeah.
I have had a lot of very, very expert research students who are fantastic improvisers, and it's been interesting to note that most of them had what you might call a shared discourse of some kind, however that was defined. But I had one particular student from Japan who didn't share that language or those sets of pre or conceptions at all, and performing with him with exactly as you described, which was that there was simultaneous activity and absolutely no connection, and that's the only terms on which you could improvise with him. Completely different from everybody else, but absolutely brutally always the case in that particular instance. So I can verify that as experience.
Is that your experience, Joe?
Sometimes, yeah. But that could be an aesthetic as well, though.
Yeah,
it could be an aesthetic. Yeah.
I think I just came from Vancouver and I performed in November. And another very interesting opinion from the audience is that he just differences. I just play white noise and sine wave at that time.
Yeah.
He said, you play sound and I play music, so you're different. So
Different world, yeah.
it's almost same.
Same issue, yeah. Yeah.
You differentiate the sound and the music. Even if I play in stage, from one point I perform on the stage, it's almost like a music. So
That's very.
When I saw Joe play, I saw him in it looked like very much like seeing a musician, seemed really feeling like you're in the presence of someone who could manipulate and control their equipment to control sound in a way that was so even musicianship, you know, really. But then so yeah.
I think it's worth as well mentioning though, because I started worrying that we're heading towards sort of a very orthodox position here, sort of collective orthodoxy, that somehow digital systems need to have these grains and these difficulties and these resistances in them. There is, of course, another argument, a very strong cultural argument, that we should make with digital systems what digital systems give us. And I'm thinking of someone maybe like Ryoki Ikeda, or one of the other sort of ultra minimalist, you know, actually that with digital systems we can produce sounds that are radically different from the sounds we could, you know, comfortably produce with our bodies and stuff like that. So there is also another thing to those that sort of almost what people think of as pure digital. I'm thinking particularly of Shigeto Wada, who was at the PC did with the 12 computers that were simply talking to one another in blips and squeaks and stuff like that, and actually the only human involvement had been to design that system and then just let it get on with it. And there really were no human hands or those sort of models and that sort of in that system. And actually that's also a very beautiful, very engaging thing to come to. Maybe because of its difference, maybe because it's unusualness, or maybe because it buys us again another bit of permission, another bit of space where we can go and we can listen to things that we wouldn't be able to listen to if we had to do them with our bodies. You know, so there's a just to keep that, not to lose sight of that, and we don't get sort of, you know, in a lovely warm bath of sort of, you know, sort of physical modelled orthodoxies. There's other things that we can do with this stuff as well, just to flag that and sort of reinforce what Simon's saying there as well. I'm arguing against myself. But
yeah, I mean, to make that a bit more comprehensible, Shigeto's arguably extreme aesthetic position is that our inability to distinguish between different kinds of digital noise is simply an inadequacy of human beings, not a problem of music, if you like. So there is something to think and talk about there.
Well, it's true, but it's easy to imagine that the medium of music could change in the future. Our connectivity right now is still, I mean, our music, you could say, was electronic. Some of my music is purely electronic sometimes, you know, but the interface is still sound. It still requires sound to transmit it to me. And there's a point at which you can imagine the sound part going away. I don't like that idea personally. I kind of like sound, but I can imagine that people could still call something music which had nothing to do with sound, as long as it was about moving in time.
Like scores,
for example. But except the problem there, it's reading instead of, you know, it's got a time issue.
People talk about music with poetry. Is that kind of, you know?
Yeah, poets always talk about the music as
Yeah.
being the thing, you know.
Which is a sounded thing that we wouldn't necessarily relate to music.
But I think that's partly a territorial instinct as well, isn't it? And whichever area you come from, your instinct is to try to incorporate all the others.
Yeah.
So as I was listening to Joel talking and saying how inarticulate he was, and thinking to myself how wonderfully articulately he was putting the idea that actually, if I took his argument just a little bit further, rather than taking the usual logic that language starts us off and constructs us and that music is a sort of special case, you could invert that logic and think of music as being this sort of kind of core modelling and simulating activity, and language as being one particularly impoverished case of music. You know, and I think that would be a much more interesting position to start from.
Really?
Yeah, there's a nice book by David Hurrell called Is Language a Music?
Yeah, I didn't know that. Well.
I think something interesting as well when you think about the relationship between music and the brain. We talk about the language and the way our brain is reacting to music, and there's been some cases of people who had brain seizure
Mm.
and who lost completely the sense of pitch, who couldn't recognize any
Mm.
melody, but
Yeah.
still had the sense of rhythm.
Mm-hmm.
And people on the opposite would, on the other hand, who had like no sense of rhythm, who couldn't like keep a steady rhythm, but still could recognize like a Beatles melody.
Yeah, yeah.
Something like that. So it's two parts of the brain, different parts of the brain were actually working together, which are separated. So I think it's much more complex than
Yeah.
just, it's not like the mythic part of the
Yeah.
brain, which is like the music, and it's more like a language in the sense of it's like your have relationship inside your brain
Mhm.
to music, which is not, and that's why maybe some people say we have, maybe people who are bad at math at school don't like complex rhythmical music. Who knows? It would be
Who knows,
interesting
yeah.
to make like a comparison.
Yeah.
But yeah, so it seems to me like I think it's not that simple. You know?
No, no.
Well,
You can't generalize.
Yeah, I was just going to say that throws up the idea as well that we're talking about music as this very inclusive thing.
Mm.
That music is something that's physical, it's to do with listening, it's to do with systems, it's to do with chords, but it's also to do with affordances and fast reactions and immediacy. And yet we talk about language as though it was writing.
Mm.
And in fact we should maybe be saying writing when we're talking about this very what Simon calls an impoverished form of music, that is language. Language, from what Ludo's just saying, is just as rich and complex. This is part of language. The expression on my face is part of language. It's not just the phonemes in some abstract sense that I'm producing, it's also the intonation.
Mm-hmm.
It's my regional accent. It's the group of people I'm talking to already. We're sharing this language, even though we're also at the same time mutually misunderstanding a lot of what this language is doing. You know, actually language is just as, and I'm just sort of putting this in as the devil's advocate again, just to resist this idea that we can talk, language bad, music good, language exclusive, repressive, dreadful, music lovely and warm and gorgeous and it includes everything. That's nonsense, that's just ideology. You know, I think Ludo brings up a very important point there. If the idea of a distributed consciousness actually has any basis in fact, which it seems to have, then anything we do, you know, doodling on a piece of paper is potentially just as complex and rich and social and God knows what else as anything else. Just to again, I'm not sure I'd 100% agree with myself on that, but just as a warning, I'm just worrying that some words are getting demonized and other words are getting disproportionately valorized.
Well, it's about, in my case, I really was being political 20 years ago when I was doing this, because I really was trying to shift. I mean, there was nobody doing, not just improvised music in Europe, no one was doing live anything electronic. Nobody. And so that was so there was a sense of politics always involved in what we did.
I think there's also a big thing about, in the world of serious music, there's this big thing, I think, which is to put some boundaries which has nothing to do with music, which is more like a social thing, like, oh, you cannot do that. Like it's like saying Pierre Boulez is saying like, oh, if musicians were good, they would be composers. You know, it's kind of saying like, you have to think about it, you have to intellectualize it and put it on a piece of paper, and then it's done, and then okay, well, oh shit, we need some musicians to do that, shame, but well, we can't escape from that. And that's where electronic music I think is really interesting, because it's like the ultimate victory of the composer, because it doesn't need
you don't need musicians. Oh, exactly. And when you read what people said in the early days of electronic music, that was one of the arguments. You don't have to deal with these undependable musicians.
Yeah, and it was Frank Zappa was saying that he was using St. Clavier in the 80s, when they were first dancers, like do like really, really complex. And he was saying like, well, the good thing about musicians that they can do things that computers will never be able to do. But the bad thing about this is that they need to eat, and they're not on time, and, they need to learn, and they forget things, and computers not. So yeah, from a composer point of view, like the electronic music is like the blessing.
Yeah.
And in the Boulez example at Eargum, of course, as Georgina Bourne tells us, it's not just a case of musicians, but the right kind of musician. The pact to keep Stevie Wonder out of Eargum. He wasn't allowed in.
Well, the pact to keep Boulez out of pop music.
Yeah, it's like the conservatories are like a way of turning guys into like kind of machines. They're like doing that. We learn like to do it this way, and they're learning like to read. Like if you read that note, that little dot on this line, it means that, and you do it that way. And if you get a little link, then do it that way, and it means these guys in the end are just tools for the composers. They don't have, and that's why this guy was scared that as long as they don't have scores or like guidelines, they're like lost and they cannot play. So it's kind of, I think it's a sad thing somehow.
I think it's not that they cannot play in that situation. I think it's that they don't let themselves, and they aren't allowed to, because there isn't that frame. I mean, I know a lot of professional classical musicians who would only ever perform pieces they've learned or from music, but who actually at home play. But it's like there isn't that space for that kind of practice to be a public music in the way that being a jazz musician or a free improviser we immediately have. Politically, jazz musicians and improvisers have made spaces for themselves, or claimed spaces, or inherited spaces for themselves, and that's there's a sort of almost a pedagogical fracture there. That actually a lot of these musicians are actually really interesting what they play when they're not playing off music or play pieces they've learned. But, I mean again it's almost like somebody who's been given that privileged position of being allowed to call himself a musician saying, oh yeah, but I'm not a musician.
Yeah, it's kind of a
I can't do that stuff. It's weird.
Yeah, it's kind of a ritual political thing. It's like these classical musicians in my class, and talking with her, I was telling her about, for me, from my point of view, the absurdity of some conventions in classical music. Like you have to dress yourself, you have to put your shirt there, even though you're a singer and you're supposed to be singing, but no, you have to put your tie in and you have to go off stage and then wait for the
7 seconds.
7 seconds and then come back. It's very and she was saying, yeah, I agree with you. It doesn't make sense musically. We don't need that, but she's been raised up and been classically trained, and if she doesn't see that on stage, she's shocked. And it's kind of a ritual political thing that has nothing to do with music.
If music is a social thing, though, how can social and political things have nothing to do with music?
Yeah,
well,
exactly.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, there's this whole thing. It's part of the world of classical music, and wouldn't be classical music if it wasn't that.
Exactly.
So
it would be something else.
So it's kind
be
of
like
a perverse thing.
Yeah, it'd be like going to a gig and there was no stage diving, if that's what you're expecting.
Right.
If everybody sat still and played and tried not to move very much, it'd be a really weird gig.
At the same time, that's the way things are evolving from reacting to that. But I don't think that
bands such as The Residents, of course, did that.
Classical music is coming from a long history, and I don't know how a thing would happen when happening like 200 years ago. I don't think there would be that. There would be less conventions, I think, and much more spontaneity in like the performance. And the performers had much more higher. I think it's really a 20th century thing about the composer being like over the top of the musician world. Well,
I think it's also possible that the society that music developed in may have been more, that sort of formality might have been a more normal and accepted part of certain kinds of social meetings as well.